All right, everybody. Hello and welcome to our next topic, which is psychological tests. All right, we've talked in general about how we measure different variables and concepts. And here in psychological testing, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that. We're going to talk about different types of psychological tests and different domains of psychology, how they're used, and how they are constructed. So let's go ahead and get started here. We'll start off with the use of psychological tests, all right? Why and where are they used? Psychological tests are available in a number of ways. We have tests that are, say, commercially available or available to nearly anybody. Think personality tests. We have some tests that are only available to researchers, things like diagnostic tests or intelligence tests, things that perhaps have a bit more weight to them in terms of their interpretation. And we use tests in all different domains of psychology. All right, we use them in clinical psychology for diagnosis, we use them in educational psychology, we use it in child psychology, industrial psychology, and the list goes on and on. All right, we use testing to evaluate a number of different phenomena. Most notably, or one of the most popular psychological tests has been intelligence testing. So a lot of this lecture will focus around intelligence testing specifically because it has an interesting history and trajectory as a psychological test. I have two striking gentlemen here. We have Galton and Binet. All right, so these are two famous scientists. All right, so we'll start with Galton. We're going to go in order of history. So Galton was the first to bring up the idea of basically measuring cognitive aptitude. All right, and he said that we should do so by measuring the speed in which people could respond or react to a stimuli, something like a flashing light. Where this becomes a little more interesting is that Galton was actually a cousin of Darwin, Charles Darwin, that guy, that famous guy on the origin of species and natural selection, all of that good stuff. So Galton was trying to carve out his name in science as well, and he thought he would do so using speed of reaction time to measure cognitive aptitude. The idea here was basically that if the brain was more insulated or more wired and more quick to respond, that makes for a more intelligent brain. We know that this isn't exactly the case now, though the brain and quickness of response is certainly related to intelligence and problem solving. This becomes problematic when Galton was actually using this as fuel in the fire of the eugenics movement, basically suggesting that some individuals were superior to others in this specific sense. So then Binet came along sometime later, a couple decades later, and Binet said, hey, I think there's something to cognitive aptitude testing, and I think we really ought to do it, but we need to be careful, right? We don't want to label people incorrectly or unjustly. And Binet specifically set out to create an intelligence scale that would help children get placed in school, get placed at their correct academic level. But Binet's main fear, he was vocal about this, is he was afraid that these types of measures would end up labeling people in a negative way. And boy, was he onto something, and we're going to talk about how this type of testing became inherently problematic throughout time. But it's also important to note that the Stanford Binet intelligence test is one of the main intelligence tests still used today, so his ideas still persist with us in modern psychology. Galton was also a little bit interesting, going back to Galton and his crazy ideas. He actually, now that we've gotten through our own data collection in this class, Galton had people come to him to give him data. He would basically set up at fairs and events and have individuals come to him and pay him money to do things like measure their height and weight, things that weren't readily available to people at home in the way that they are now. So you could say he was a little clever or intelligent in that way. So how do we test intelligence now? Well, we test it by a number of factors and domains, all right? So it's not as simple as responding quickly to a stimulus. This is the organization of the Stanford Binet, the 5th edition. This is a more modern or current edition of an intelligence test. So I just want us to take a look at the factors and domains that we have here, because you'll notice that this is a multiple dimensional test. We have verbal and nonverbal domains, and then we have a level of factors. We have fluid reasoning, knowledge, quantitative reasoning. Of course, quantitative we've talked about in here. That's using numbers or mathematics, visual spatial processing, and working memory. All right, we have verbal and non-verbal components to each of these factors. So it's meant to be a more holistic approach, looking at multiple facets of intelligence. We're not going to elaborate too much on intelligence as a topic here, since we're focusing more on the research methods. However, there are multiple theories of intelligence. There are triarchic theories of intelligence, where there's 3 major modes of intelligence. We have even greater categorical intelligence. Gardner had, I think, 8 total intelligences, with a few that maybe pop in and out circumstantially. But this is a modern intelligence test, all right? And we have these tests quantified. How do we quantify intelligence? Well, we get an intelligence score, and we compare it to a normal curve, all right? We're back to statistics. Intelligence has been standardized, meaning that we know what scores we would expect for any given norm group or any specific group. If you were to take an intelligence test, you would be compared to people like you, similar to age and other demographics as you. But here we have our basic breakdown on the normal curve, all right? We expect an average, all right? Remember, most people will score around the average. We have our normal curve breakdown percentages in here as well. Most people will score around 100, and we have standard deviations of 16. Then we have on the bottom here, how do we quantify it, or how do we essentially label or make these scores useful? Well, we usually have a lower end score that's meant to suggest some type of cognitive disability, and higher end of our scores leaning towards gifted or genius, right? You've maybe seen these different terms to quantify intelligence. So why are we worried about this? Why are we worried about the labeling here? Well, because it carries some social connotation, all right? And let me get my head out of the way here. All right, so this is how we categorize intelligence. I have then and now, all right? So then being when these tests were first formulated, and now being the 5th edition here that we're discussing. So if we look on the left, let's take a look through these names, these categories that they've created for these different groups of scores. Everything looks good for the first couple of lines, right? We have genius, very superior, superior. Going back to eugenics, right? Superiority is not exactly a word that we want to use today when describing someone's intelligence. Then we have average, and then we start to get into some words that don't seem very nice, right? Wow, these words seem kind of harsh, sort of mean. But at the time, these words were actually crafted specifically for this, for labeling the intelligence of individuals. They got their connotation or their stigma from this type of psychological testing. So not very nice, right, by today's standards. So then we have today's classification that we use to quantify intelligence or to categorize it. So you can take a look here and see that these words are a little bit more soft, right, to meet today's standards. But the same structure applies, right? This test is meant to place somebody at either an average level, a greater or lesser level than the rest of the population. And for psychology, this is great for detecting disability, right? Or detecting a number of things that can be tied to intelligence. And as Binet intended, can help to place children in school and assess academic aptitude of others, though we know that intelligence is not the only measure of academic aptitude. So that's where we stand today, right? But we still have to look back into history and assess how this type of labeling can be problematic and how this type of testing can be problematic. So what I have here is a graph from an old study, a study that was done around the time of the civil rights movement. All right, so we're back in history now. So IQ scores were used to assess the cognitive aptitude of children, all right? That's what they had set out to do. So some researchers went ahead and did this, all right? They went out and gave intelligence tests to a number of children. This particular study was done in Harlem, and they were looking across two groups of children. They were looking at black children and white children. The study was done to suggest that anti-segregation was not a good idea. All right, they were suggesting that segregation should remain because combining students, integrating black and white children together in schools would be problematic. It would hold white students back. And this is a graph that they came up with, a figure that they came up with to illustrate this. So if we take a look, we see the general normal curve shape that we would expect, right, with both groups having means or averages towards the center here. But we do see a specific discrepancy between our two groups, right? We do see that the black children are scoring generally lesser than white children, and this was used in a segregationist argument. So what's the problem here? All right, what happened here? Well, what happened here is there was culture embedded into the intelligence tests. And by culture, what we mean is things like certain vocabulary that wouldn't have been known to the black children at this time as the tests were constructed by a different group of people. There are two examples of this that I think are quite blaring. One was about counting money, counting change. When after they took the test, the children were asked if they had any issues, right? Where were they having trouble? The black children said that they didn't understand the wording on creating change for money, right? They used terms like quarters, nickels, dimes, and pennies, when in their neighborhood in Harlem, they were called 1-cent pieces, 5-cent pieces, 10-cent pieces, and 25-cent pieces. So totally different vernacular. Vocabulary as well. Some vocabulary was specifically geared to those of higher socioeconomic status. Words like yacht or catamaran, fancy boats that you might not know about if you live in a landlocked area or are a lower socioeconomic status. So intelligence tests have adapted, all right? We've changed how we test for intelligence. And a large part of this is using culture-free tasks, all right? Eliminating culture and honing in on more psychological variables, right? Here we specifically have visual and spatial examples. Of course, we can't completely eliminate the verbal components from intelligence testing, but they try to be more sensitive to cultural considerations. But here we have some culture-free tasks, all right? And I urge you to give these a try, and I will post the answers on our course page. But see what you can make of these, right? These are the type of tests that you might do if you participate in an intelligence test. In fact, many intelligence tests have a physical version of these where you would be physically constructing these things in space. So give these a try, right? Notice that these have very little instructions. There's very little text. Some of them have no text at all. So this is meant to eliminate that cultural impact on this testing. So all of this really leads us to a desire to be careful with our psychological testing, right? And I think a great way to think about this is through generalization. Remember, we talked all about generalization a few topics back and how it's so important for our research to be generalizable, all right? If it's not generalizable, it doesn't have anything to say. We can't make any inferences about larger groups or populations. So I think that this is an apt comic to describe this, right? For fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam of climbing a tree. So I think we get the joke here. But the question is, if a test isn't generalizable, if it's not accurate, if it's not valid, what's the point, right? That's why we need to be very careful with our psychological tests, especially when it comes to things like intelligence that can dictate someone's educational path, or things like diagnoses, right? Getting a diagnosis is something very serious. We want our tests to be accurate and generalizable and trustworthy. So standardization rears its head again. We talked a bit about this in our survey research topic. But why do we standardize tests, all right? What's the point of standardizing a test? For intelligence tests, they are standardized tests. Everyone will receive the same version or very similar versions of the same test so that we can expect standardized scores in return. And we do this to understand who we're comparing these scores to. We have norms or norm groups. Norms are tests or measures that have been administered to large relevant samples of participants. Then we have what we call norm groups for comparison. Think of other standardized tests, all right? We have the SAT, the ACT, tests that are also becoming a little bit outdated, I will say. But they have norm groups, right? You'll be compared to others who have taken the same measure. And this, of course, goes back to our normal curve. The closer you are to the center, the closer you are to the average. If you go into the positive end of this curve, you'll be above others, right? Above average. But standardization is helpful. Again, we discussed this with survey research because it lets scientists communicate with each other more effectively, right? If two people have taken the same test administered by different researchers, you should still have comparable results, right? And of course, with statistics underlying so much of this class, using the normal curve as a framework for our statistical decisions is also a form of standardization, right? If we can remember all the way back to standard deviations. The point is to standardize our scores so we can communicate across different types of data. So we have a few more considerations with psychological tests. We can have tests that are unidimensional or multidimensional. A unidimensional test will take a look at one specific underlying dimension. Multidimensional scales will look at two or more underlying dimensions, and ultimately a relationship between the two. So here's a visual example of stress and scholastic ability. And again, in our class, in our case, we're constructing surveys that might be multidimensional or have multiple domains. They're setting out to test for multiple different measures. So this is important to consider. All right, we have item analysis, all right? Item analysis is a statistical technique. It specifically takes a look at the items that you have in your test, all right? So item analysis can be done in a number of ways, but we're basically trying to purify a measure. These are supposed to tell you how good the information is that you're getting from each individual question. You might have two questions that aren't exactly the same, but are yielding exactly the same results or responses. All right, so I have two examples here at the bottom. All right, I enjoy going to school versus going to school is something that I enjoy. All right, if we're getting exactly the same intercorrelations between these questions, people are responding the same to each of these questions, then we can get rid of one, right? We can purify the measure and get rid of specific questions. Item analysis takes some other forms as well. Many of your instructors might do this for, say, multiple choice tests. You can run an item analysis and see what percentage of each question is correct. Right, if you have a question that nearly everybody missed, it was likely not the fault of the students, but more the fault of the instruction, right? So that's how we purify measures, make sure that we're getting quality information from each of the items in our measures. So lastly here, we're going to talk about how do we administer psychological tests, and specifically the qualifications needed and how you can get your hands on tests like this. So I'll warn you now, you're going to see a big wall of text in a second. These are just the qualification levels for administering different psychological tests. So please don't write this down or anything to that effect. But here we have them. All right. So we have three different major levels of qualification, all right, different types of tests. So we alluded to this at the beginning, right? Something like a personality test might not need as many qualifications as we would need for an intelligence or a diagnostic test. So we have three general levels of qualification here. The first, level A, is no specific qualifications. Level B, we have a few instances here, things like master's degrees or certification or a license or some type of formal educational training. And then our last qualification level, which is generally a doctorate degree in psychology or education or clinical psychology or something of the like, right? Also other licenses and professional certifications. So I want to bring a couple different types of psychological tests to your attention to get you thinking about the different types of tests that we might encounter. All right, so here's the first, the Career Decision-Making System Revised. You've maybe taken one of these before. Lots of high schools and even colleges will offer tests like this to get you on some trajectory toward a career you might enjoy based on a level of responses that you might give. So here we have qualification level A. All right, anybody could give this. A public school teacher could give this. You might even be able to purchase this yourself and self-score it, right? There's no qualifications for taking this particular test. It does say it is self-scored. So the idea here is that this is a low-risk test, right? Of course, you want it to be accurate. You don't want it to send you on an incorrect path. But there's little room for professional interpretation of the results of something like this. All right, let's take a look at another. All right, the BDI, the Beck Depression Inventory. We've talked a little bit about this in class as well. This is a very well-known measure. It's very quick to take. Here it says 5 minutes self-administered. But this is qualification level B, all right? This is a step up because I think we might be able to imagine how damaging it might be for somebody to purchase this test themselves and then determine that they fall into the depressed threshold. And then what do, right? If you don't have a professional to interpret or advise what you do based on your results, that can be problematic or damaging to individuals. So here's an example of sort of a mid-range test. But notice that this is also 5 minutes and self-administered. This isn't a very involved psychological test, but the outcomes do have a significant meaning. All right, now we have an interesting one, all right? Test of memory malingering. All right, malingering is an interesting word. If we've not heard of the word malingering, it's essentially faking or pretending, for lack of better words. So the overview says the point of this test is to discriminate between malingering and true memory impairments. Right, true memory impairment versus malingering, or basically faking memory impairment. So naturally, this seems pretty difficult to measure, right? This isn't something you'd want to take and self-score, especially because we're dealing with malingering, right? Or issues with the accuracy of memory. So this would be a qualification level C. We need a doctorate or a professional licensed person to interpret the results of this test. All right, so something to just bring to our awareness, right, is that these tests are very expensive, right? These tests are expensive to create. They take a lot of work to create, to normalize, to standardize. So I just want to bring to your attention that these are not cheap, all right? These are difficult to obtain. And I bring this to your attention for a specific reason. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about intelligence tests, finish off on intelligence since we've been talking about it. So intelligence tests are notoriously complex to administer. We do have qualification level C here. This will take 60 to 90 minutes to complete, and this is even short for an intelligence test. Some intelligence tests will take you all day, and that's no joke. It can take up to 6 to 8 hours to complete all tests in certain intelligence tests. But the scoring options, if you take a look, it's a little bit complicated, all right? There are a lot of dimensions, a lot of levels in a test like this. We took a look at the domains and factors going into this test. So scoring is complicated, and rightfully so, because intelligence is complicated and has significant implications to the person taking the intelligence test. So I bring this up because, we'll take a look at this here as well. I bring this up because intelligence is something specifically that can be damaging if misinterpreted, right? Just think about how damaging it would be to have your intelligence misconstrued to you, misinterpreted. So again, here, it might be a little bit hard for you to see, but these tests are very expensive, all right? Thousands of dollars to get these tests. So what can happen, all right, is something like this. All right, this is an eBay listing for the type of test we're discussing. You can buy it now, right? You can purchase it, have it shipped to your home. This is, of course, unethical or illegal. You're not supposed to be able to get your hands on these materials unless you're qualified to do so. But I want to point this out because we should be very careful about the origin of results of psychological tests, right? If somebody purchases this and are not qualified to interpret the results, getting information from them might be unreliable. So there are multiple reasons someone might do this, right? They can make some money off this, which is not good, and that is not ethical. And they can also bypass those qualifications to use information like this in their research. All right, thankfully we do have ethical boards in place, kind of safeguards from preventing this from happening. But here's an example, right? You can go on eBay, grab one, and test yourself, and that could be inherently problematic. So that was our overview of psychological testing. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you over on our next lecture.